Timothy here. Come join me today as I dive into accidents that are both tragic and deserving of the Darwin Awards. From a drunkard who decided to open a coconut with a chainsaw, to a teen who let a train pass directly over him, ending his daredevil streak in the stupidest way ever. It was August 11th, 2015, behind a concrete house on the outskirts of Bitung, North Sulawesi, Indonesia, where a family barbecue had been running through most of the afternoon when the kind of decision gets made that a family never fully recovers from. Raflan Tewu was 38 years old and worked as a mechanic on inter-island ferries docked near Bitung port. Among relatives and neighbors, he was known as someone who pushed situations further than necessary. Now I know people like this, and I'm assuming that it's not out of aggression, but out of a need to get a reaction. At cookouts, they said that he was reliably the loudest voice in the yard. He drank heavily at gatherings, and that day was no different. By early afternoon, he had been drinking for several hours. When someone brought out a machete to open the coconuts near the food table, Raflan objected loudly that it was taking too long. He went to a shed at the back of the property and came back with a chainsaw. Several relatives laughed. One cousin raised a phone and started filming vertically. The combined laughter, the camera going up, turned something dangerous into a performance, and nobody stopped it. The decision isn't entirely without surface logic. Chainsaws cut through hard material quickly, and faster had been his stated argument from the beginning. What he didn't account for, or chose not to, was that a young coconut's curved shell behaves unpredictably under a moving chain. He pinned a coconut against a low wooden stool with his left hand and brought the running saw down one-handed from above. The chain made contact with the shell and immediately ran unevenly. A curved coconut surface doesn't give a chain a clean bite, especially when it strikes at a slight angle rather than a flat cutting plane. The chain lost its bite against the curved shell and began to skid across the surface instead of cutting into it. The guide bar glanced sideways before rotational kickback snapped the saw upward toward him, driven by the sudden binding of the upper quadrant of the bar tip. Multiple people saw the moment the saw kicked upward. It happened mid-motion, with no pause between contact and consequence, too fast for anyone to react or step in. The chain tore through the left side of Raflan's jaw and drove into his throat. The impact was immediate and violent, with the saw's momentum carrying through before the trigger could even be released. Witnesses described blood crossing the distance to the plastic table behind him, spraying outward in a short, forceful arc consistent with the blade's upward trajectory. Raflan staggered backward several steps, still holding the running chainsaw as inertia kept it active in his grip, before his legs gave out and he went down onto the gravel. Relatives ran toward him within seconds. Two grabbed towels from inside the house and pressed them against his neck in an attempt to slow the bleeding while shouting for help. The saw, still running at full throttle, continued to idle and rev intermittently on the ground after he fell until someone finally managed to pull the fuel line and stop the chain. I think about the relatives who were close enough to see every second of it and had nothing to offer but towels. There's no saving that man. Someone in the family drove him to the nearest regional hospital, but he was pronounced dead on arrival. The coroner determined cause of death to be fatal lacerations to the left jaw and anterior neck structures, with severing of the left carotid artery and jugular vein, resulting in rapid blood loss. I think the drinking is impossible to separate from this, not because alcohol makes someone pick up a chainsaw, but because it removes the small hesitation that might have made him stop. That hesitation is sometimes the only thing standing between a bad idea and a catastrophic one. And the relatives who were there, the ones who laughed, the one who filmed, they didn't cause this, but they were present for it, and that afternoon is going to sit somewhere in all of them for the rest of their lives. If you think that opener was crazy, this next guy didn't stumble into danger drunk at a family cookout. He built it, planned it, walked outside with it in broad daylight. It was May 2nd, 2014, on a narrow terraced street in Stoke-on-Trent, England, where semi-detached houses sat close enough that neighbors could hear each other's televisions through the walls. Now what happened in the next 4 minutes left most of them with something they could not unsee, and left one family with an empty chair they would eventually stop pulling out altogether. Keelan Dwyer was 34 and lived in his parents' basement flat on that same street. Unemployed for several years, they said that he spent most of his time gaming and watching online videos. Neighbors described him as loud and occasionally funny, someone who had made a habit of setting off fireworks or pressurizing aerosol cans until they popped. Most treated him as a nuisance. A few had genuinely laughed with him. He had no criminal record, no stated ambitions for the week, and no one waiting on him. I would sort of describe him as that bachelor uncle that's fun to see once in a while, but horrible to be with on a daily. Now the device he built for this incident was not random. Over what appeared to be several days, he sourced a large plastic water gun, a camping fuel canister, rubber tubing, a bicycle tire valve, and duct tape. A small candle was wired near the nozzle to serve as a continuous ignition source. To someone who had never handled flammable liquids under pressure, the logic was not entirely absent. He had likely seen similar designs demonstrated online, and they appeared to function. What those videos did not show was that working versions were typically metal, not injection-molded plastic rated for water, and not held together with improvised seals and adhesive under sustained pressure. I'll be honest, the gap between watching something work on a screen and understanding why it works is where a lot of these stories begin. Keelan closed that gap with confidence he had not earned. He filled the reservoir with approximately 1 to 2 quarts of gasoline and pressurized the tank using the modified valve setup before walking out to the front yard around 7:40 in the evening. Several neighbors noticed him immediately. 2 were watching from a window. 1 stood near her gate. A neighbor later told responders he had seen Keelan do similar things before and assumed it would amount to a small flame and some shouting. When Keelan squeezed the trigger, fuel moved through the line in an uneven stream. Within seconds, the pressure inside the reservoir forced fuel past the taped seals near the handle. One section of tubing slipped loose, spraying gasoline across his chest and the front of his legs. The candle caught the vapor before he released the trigger. Witnesses described the ignition as immediate and total. Not a flash, but a sudden engulfment that spread across his fuel-soaked clothing almost instantly. The burst of flame was visible from at least 4 houses down. Keelan stumbled sideways, then forward, moving blindly toward the pavement. Flames continued burning across his torso and back as he went down. The neighbor near the gate later told a local reporter she heard the sound before she understood what she was seeing. A low, pressurized roar, and then screaming. He collapsed face first near the parked vehicle at the curb. His father came out within moments carrying a garden hose. Water knocked the visible flame down repeatedly, but gasoline trapped in his saturated clothing and along the pavement kept reigniting in patches. A delivery driver passing on the adjacent road stopped his vehicle and called emergency services at approximately. Fire crews arrived 8 minutes later, and paramedics transported Keelan to a regional burn unit. He died the following morning. The post-mortem determined the cause of death to be full-thickness thermal burns, covering approximately 70 to 80% of his body surface area, with airway involvement consistent with inhalation of superheated gases. Keelan was likely bored, stagnant, and had built an identity around being the one who did the dangerous thing that made people look. That identity had functioned for years at low cost. The man-child persona, sustained by an audience and answered only by escalation, eventually demands something it cannot take back. Now, opposite to that, this next story is just one quiet guy on a rainy night making a decision that took about 40 minutes to kill him. It was November 7th, 2017, in Naniwa Ward, Osaka. A wet Tuesday night, drainage channels running hard after 2 hours of steady rain. The kind of night where small decisions carry consequences that cannot be undone, and where the margin between a minor inconvenience and something irreversible is measured in inches. Masaru Hineno, 41, was described by colleagues as someone who rarely socialized outside work. Now, I'm not sure if it's relevant, but it's worth noting that he had finalized a divorce 8 months earlier and was managing the financial strain of it alone. That evening, he had joined co-workers for late-night karaoke, a rare outing for him. He drove an aging sedan with unreliable locks and had a known habit of misplacing his keys. The group broke up shortly before midnight. Security footage from a camera above a nearby parking structure entrance captured him near a rectangular maintenance storm drain set into the pavement, a cast iron frame covering an access shaft roughly 18 inches wide and just over 2 feet long. The keys dropped through the opening. Now, at this point, I think it would have been better if he asked for professional help, but instead, he crouched and looked in. Big mistake. He tried feeding an umbrella handle down through the grate first. When that didn't reach, removing his jacket and attempting to reach further made a kind of situational sense. The rain was coming down, the hour was late, and the keys were likely visible several feet below the frame in runoff pooled along the bottom of the shaft. Someone can really talk themselves forward one small step at a time until they're past any recoverable point. The stretch of pavement outside the structure was poorly lit, the drain partially shadowed by a support column. By the time Masaru repositioned himself at the opening, the gutter flow had risen to cover the lower edge of the frame. He lowered one arm and shoulder into the opening to reach farther, then slipped forward on the wet pavement after shifting too much of his weight over the shaft. He went in head first. A pedestrian captured on the same footage passed within roughly 15 feet of him, approximately 4 minutes after he became wedged. The footage showed the pedestrian slow slightly, glance in the direction of the drain and continue walking. His legs were above the pavement, moving in brief, uneven kicks at first. The pedestrian did not stop. The movements on camera continued for roughly 22 minutes. His legs pushed repeatedly against the shaft walls, consistent with someone who understood the situation and was actively trying to reverse it. After 10 minutes, the motions became infrequent. The runoff at face level was less than 2 feet deep. I don't think the people who walked past had any idea what they were actually seeing. His position, inverted, wedged at the chest, unable to raise his head above the flow, made the water's depth irrelevant. The legs on camera eventually stopped moving. A taxi driver parked approximately 40 meters away noticed them motionless and contacted emergency services. The call was placed nearly an hour after Masaru first entered the drain. Rescue personnel used hydraulic cutting equipment to remove the grate frame. Masaru was pronounced dead at the scene. The coroner documented drowning as the cause of death. Police released still images from the footage requesting witnesses to come forward. The footage itself was never publicly aired. No changes to the drain infrastructure at the site were publicly documented. Imagine this: several people walked past and none stopped. I don't think that's entirely a moral failure. Most people don't know how to read what they're seeing in the dark, in the rain, at midnight. But Masaru was alive and trying to get out for most of that window. Can you imagine if that was you? It's horrific. And speaking of horrific deaths, this upcoming incident features a beach, sand, and a woman's own hands. It was January 19th, 2018, on a windswept stretch of coastline near Canoa Quebrada in Ceará, Brazil. That afternoon, the wind drove fine sand aggressively, cutting into skin and food. Now, most people retreated to their towels, but one person found a different solution. Lissandra Veloz was 29 years old and worked as a substitute teacher, rotating between primary school assignments and weekend tutoring shifts to cover the schedule gaps. The coast trip was a budget holiday, 2 nights away from lesson plans and classroom noise. The sand had been blowing since noon. By mid-afternoon, it was relentless, fine enough to cut through sunscreen. Lissandra had already moved her towel twice. The dune wall at the upper beach offered a natural windbreak, and what she began doing next was not born of recklessness. It was a practical response to an irritating problem, scaled further than it should have been. She dug for nearly 2 hours with a folding shovel, but the walls repeatedly slumped back in as fast as she cleared them. Witnesses nearby watched her work steadily, tossing sand outward in even motions. The pit reached an estimated 4 feet deep and roughly 4 feet wide, but never held its shape for long. She lowered a picnic blanket inside it and lied down. She told her friend Camilla Norris she had built herself a private bunker before Camilla left to buy drinks from a vendor roughly 200 yards up the beach. The dune wall behind the pit had been partially undercut along sections of its base. And then the collapse happened. The dune face had folded inward. The surface was completely flat. No visible hole, no sound from below. The worst thing that happened that day looked like absolutely nothing. The same witness said she assumed the person had simply climbed out. The sand had filled in so completely it looked undisturbed, packed level with the surrounding surface. Camilla returned approximately 20 minutes later. She found flat sand. She later said she also assumed Lysandra climbed out and explored somewhere else without telling her, which annoyed her at first. So she spent several minutes scanning the beach, and when she returned to the spot and her friend was still nowhere to be found, she looked at the covered spot and her heart sank. She began digging with her hands and screaming. Beachgoers reached her within seconds. Lifeguards stationed along the waterline arrived within 3 minutes. Everyone dug barehanded. Lysandra was eventually lifted from the sand, unresponsive. Resuscitation was attempted on site and failed. She was declared dead on the beach. Here's a food for thought. Lifeguards train for what kills people in the water. Nobody trains for this. The medical examiner determined cause of death to be mechanical asphyxiation by thoracic compression. Saturated sand had prevented her chest from expanding. The sand had simply pressed steadily and completely until it was over. Camilla gave a statement to investigators and did not return to that beach. A vendor further up the beach told a local journalist he had noticed the depth of the depression from a distance and considered walking over. He did not. This is one of the most preventable deaths I have come across, not because Lysandra was reckless, but because this specific danger is completely invisible until it isn't. Wet coastal sand near a dune wall behaves like a slow trap. And most people have no reason to know that. She didn't. Out next story starts with 2 teenagers, a slow-moving machine, and an uncle who thought it was fine. It was September 3rd, 2013, on a stretch of unpaved road in Jalisco, Mexico. The shift was ending, equipment idling, no one in a hurry to leave. But something that afternoon was already sliding toward a line no one would see until it was crossed. And you have to wonder, how many warnings did they ignore before the first one even registered? Edre Palafox was 16 and worked informally at a rural road construction site run by extended family. His cousin Joselito Vaca, 17, worked alongside him through that summer on cleanup and material work. Neither had safety training. Workers remembered Edre as restless, quick to finish a task and immediately looking for something else. He climbed on idle equipment during breaks and tested his footing on frames and bucket lips. No adult had told him to stop. The road to the staging area pitched gradually downhill over roughly 100 yards, rutted and hardened where rain had dried into the surface. Late afternoon light had dropped below the western tree line, throwing the lower stretch of road into shadow. The air had that flat, still quality of dry dusk settling in. A few workers had already moved to their vehicles. The shift was effectively over. The site supervisor, Edre's uncle, needed to reposition the wheel loader. He did not stop both boys from climbing into the front bucket. As the machine moved downhill, Edre stood at the lip and repeatedly scraped his boot soles along the road surface. Co-workers stood nearby and laughed. No one said anything. Now I think the moment the uncle allowed the machine to move with them in it, he owned what came next. The loader bounced repeatedly over the uneven downhill road. Idre's right boot hung beyond the bucket lip as he shifted his stance and struck the raised edge of a hardened rut while the machine continued downhill. His leg pulled forward and down with the machine before any correction was possible. Joselito lunged and lost his footing, sliding out of the bucket sideways onto the road. The loader's front tire, a large commercial wheel carrying the full front-end weight of the machine, rolled over his chest and abdomen. The uncle felt the resistance through the cab a half-second before he understood what it was. He braked. The machine stopped. 3 workers ran toward the front of the loader. 2 stopped before getting close. Idre was partially pinned beneath the wheel with severe open injuries to his midsection visible from several feet away. 2 men turned and vomited. The uncle climbed from the cab screaming. Joselito lay on the road near the bucket, unhurt but unable to stand from shock. 1 worker drove until he had cell reception and called emergency services. Idre was unresponsive on arrival and died before extraction was completed. The coroner identified the cause of death as catastrophic crush trauma to the thorax and abdomen. Multiple rib fractures, rupture of the liver and spleen, and traumatic laceration of the abdominal aorta. Death resulted from rapid internal hemorrhage. The uncle faced negligent homicide charges in the weeks that followed. However, the case stalled when the family declined to cooperate with investigators. The construction company categorized the incident as an unauthorized ride, as though 2 teenagers entered that bucket on their own initiative while adults stood nearby and laughed. Teenagers do dumb things. That is part of being 16, not a character flaw. Idre scraping his boots off a moving machine while adults laughed is exactly what happens when no one decides to be the person who says, "Stop." The adults watching and the uncle who allowed it made that decision, and the company's answer of unauthorized ride means they chose paperwork over accountability. All right, this next story is one that got under my skin in a different way, because this time there was no uncle, no peer pressure, no one egging anyone on. It was October 6th, 2016, on the northern edge of Yellowstone, where the Gardner River cuts through basalt and dry grass in the last light before the mountains take everything, and where 2 men made a choice the cold current would not forgive. Berneck Miller was 35, a part-time taxidermy hobbyist from central Montana who worked property maintenance for a regional housing company and processed game mounts in a detached garage behind his house. Steady with detail work, always looking for side income. His friend Ivar Michaelis, 39, was a seasonal equipment operator who had worked construction sites across 3 states. The 2 had driven up that week under the pretense of a hunting trip near Yellowstone's northern boundary. The elk antlers they found were not shed. Several were still attached to skulls, and the size of the racks, some spanning over 5 feet, had apparently changed the original plan. Before we continue with the story, you first have to understand that possession of elk remains illegally taken from within Yellowstone National Park is a federal offense. And based on their actions beforehand, both men understood this. Witnesses at a filling station in Gardner later told investigators the 2 had stopped twice that afternoon, buying rope and a cheap inflatable watercraft from a local sporting goods outlet, rated for flat water use by 2 adults with minimal equipment. The raft's rated capacity was 180 pounds, including passengers. Investigators estimated the combined weight of antlers and gear loaded onto it at over 200 pounds. Rather than carry the antlers overland, where rangers patrol northern access roads at dusk, they entered the river after dark. The Gardner in early October runs cold and fast. Water temperatures that week sat near 38 degrees Fahrenheit, and the lower corridor moves over an irregular rock channel at several feet per second. A group of anglers camped roughly a quarter-mile downstream told investigators they reported the raft as riding dangerously low, water already lapping the tube seams before it reached mid-current. Half a mile downstream, the anglers heard voices. Not panic yet, but clipped and urgent, the kind that surface when something has already slipped past easy control. One described it as 2 people still working against something rather than away from it. Then came a slow exhalation, like air leaving a tire. Then something heavier. Then both voices at once. Based on the investigation, a tine from one of the larger antlers had not directly punctured the raft floor, but instead contributed to a seam failure caused by overload, shifting weight, and repeated abrasion against submerged rock and antler points under pressure. Now, instead of doing the logical, which is abandoning the load and swimming for the near bank, only 15 feet away by the way, both men instead tried to hold the raft together. The antlers shifted violently. Ivar entered the current first. The anglers later reported seeing one flashlight arc across the water and disappear, though detail was limited by darkness and spray. Brennick became entangled in the rope tied around the antler load. Within seconds, the raft folded completely. No voices were heard after that. The anglers called emergency services immediately after the raft disappeared. Search and rescue teams arrived within 2 hours. Both men were recovered submerged and pinned against a rock shelf approximately 60 yards downstream. The coroner listed cause of death for both as drowning compounded by hypothermia, with contributing injuries including deep puncture wounds to the lower torso and legs consistent with antler tines, and blunt force fractures of the skull and ribs consistent with high-speed contact with submerged rock. Their families rejected the framing and coverage that followed, calling it a tragic accident rather than the result of deliberate choices. I understand that impulse, but the antlers were illegally removed from protected land. The raft was purchased hours before entry, and the river was accessed after dark specifically to avoid detection. Those are not circumstances, they are decisions made one at a time. Greed does not always look reckless in the moment. Sometimes it looks like a solution, right up until the river becomes one instead. The antlers were confiscated and later disposed of by a federal land agency. Even years later, neither family publicly accepted the investigators' findings. Criminals being dumb is always satisfying to read and watch, and the next story is just like that, except the stupidity is tenfold. It was February 14, 2017, on a narrow residential street in the eastern quarter of Plovdiv, Bulgaria. A corner convenience store functions as a neighborhood anchor, where the owner has ran the same register for 20 years, and something idiotic was about to ruin his streak. Simeon Karov, 28, and Todor Balev, 31, had built their records through escalating property crime. Their known and suspected activity included multiple residential burglary and commercial break-in thefts. Over 3 weeks, Balev had sourced commercial blasting compound through illicit, non-traceable channels. Investigators later found no prior record of either man handling explosives, and the total quantity recovered was suggesting overcompensation rather than operational precision. The plan was simple: place a charge, blow the face off the machine, take the cash. Whether either man thought about the floor above them is a question the investigation could not answer. Now, I have to introduce to you another person in this incident, Nikolai Daskalov. He was 24 years old and had finished trade school the previous spring, working weekday shifts in his father's store while saving toward his own apartment. He had come in late that night after visiting friends across town and was asleep in the upstairs bedroom directly above the storefront entryway, roughly 18 feet above the ATM mounted to the shared wall below. See where this is going? Security footage shows 2 men spending just over 7 minutes in the entryway, making a single attempt before detonation to place charges in an ATM cavity and rear recess. The unit was bolted flush to a load-bearing interior wall extending to the residential floor above. The cavity was too narrow, so additional charges were added when the fit failed. Balev is seen pressing the final piece flat before both moved toward the exit. A resident 2 blocks east later told investigators she had been awake and sitting near her window when the night went completely white before the sound reached her. Not a bang, she said. A sudden flash followed by a delayed shock wave that made the air feel briefly compressed and disorienting. A man walking his dog one street north described feeling the pavement vibrate through the soles of his shoes before he registered any sound at all. The entryway and storefront wall ceased to exist. The ceiling structure failed downward, and the collapse propagated into the floor system above, causing a partial structural failure in the bedroom area. Nikolai was thrown into collapsing interior debris and displaced laterally across the room, striking a reinforced surface amid the structural failure. He did not survive. Karov and Balev were found beneath the collapsed entryway ceiling, killed by the structural failure they had loaded themselves under. And if you think that was the extent of it, a gas line ruptured and was later believed to have ignited during the secondary collapse phase, and secondary fires spread across the first floor. A neighbor across the street watched masonry rain onto parked cars while two residents stumbled from an adjacent building into the street, one bleeding from her forearm, both disoriented. She called emergency services from her window. Soul stupidity is scary. Stupid criminals are a different category entirely because their decisions do not usually stay contained to themselves. Firefighters spent over an hour extracting the bodies from the collapse while managing the ground floor fire. The coroner's findings in plain terms: Nikolai died from catastrophic blunt force trauma to the head and thorax consistent with high-energy impact against structural debris during collapse. Both robbers died from compressive crush injuries. Nikolai's father reopened the store 8 months later after the debris was cleared and the facade rebuilt. The ATM was not reinstalled. I do not think this was a tragedy of bad luck. I think it was a tragedy of complete indifference to consequence, to the people above them, to anything beyond the machine in front of them. And those two things are not the same. This last story is about a 16-year-old kid in India who saw something on the internet and decided to prove it was real. It was July 28, 2018, on the outskirts of Ludhiana, Punjab. A kid had watched the videos. He had done the math in his head, and in a few seconds, a moving freight train would show him exactly where his arithmetic failed. Navik Batra was 16, a 10th standard student. That summer, he had been filming challenge videos with a small group of friends near the freight lines that cut through the industrial fringe of town. Not out of malice, but out of the particular restlessness that fills a 16-year-old boy when school is out and the days feel long. One of his friends said that he had watched several videos online promoting a dangerous myth that a person could survive lying between rails beneath a moving freight train by remaining still. He believed it. That belief was the whole problem. I've been a teen, and the gap between watching something on a screen and understanding what it actually means physically is enormous. And most kids that age don't know that gap exists until something closes it for them. Navik's friend Rijul Sahni, also 16, had agreed to film. He had hesitated repeatedly by multiple accounts from workers in the area who observed the two boys near the tracks earlier that afternoon. Rijul did not want to do it, but he didn't leave, and he didn't take the phone away, and eventually he raised it and pointed it at the tracks. Rijul didn't push Navik onto those tracks, but he stayed. And staying meant something. However, like I said, at 16, I'm not sure I hold that fully against him, but I don't think it's nothing either. The freight corridor ran straight and level for roughly a quarter mile in both directions from where Navik positioned himself. The afternoon light was direct and white, and the track bed was composed of uneven ballast and sleepers that created no continuous flat or safe gap beneath the rails, a detail that would matter enormously within the next few minutes. Rail workers roughly 200 feet down the line later told investigators they had seen the boys near the track and assumed they would move, a delayed judgment that is unfortunately common in active rail environments where brief human presence is often misread as retreating behavior. Navik lay centered between the rails with his arms pressed flat against his sides and his face turned upward. The locomotive was audible well before it was visible. A low, sustained vibration in the ground, followed by the horn at distance. The train did not slow. It was running standard freight speed, approximately 35 miles per hour. The locomotive passed over Navik's position first, and the first lethal contact came not from a single hanging component, but from the leading wheel bogie and associated undercarriage assemblies, which extend inward and downward beyond the rail line. A combination of undercarriage hardware, including brake rigging, piping, and structural crossmembers, struck Navik in rapid succession as the train passed overhead. The train did not stop. Rajul dropped the phone and ran toward a group of rail workers further down the line, screaming. The workers called emergency services immediately. Navik was pronounced dead at the scene. The coroner's findings, summarized plainly, was catastrophic blunt force trauma to the skull with near immediate fatal brain injury, followed by extensive crush and shear injuries to the thorax, abdomen, and lower extremities caused by repeated contact with moving train components. Rajul gave a full statement to the police. The phone was held as evidence. Ultimately, I don't think Rajul is a bad person. I think he was a 16-year-old boy who didn't know how to say no to his friend, and now he has to carry what he saw for the rest of his life. That is its own sentence.